All right, guys, thanks for another conversation here. I think it'd be interesting to talk about the various different streams in evangelicalism. And one small stream is this young, reformed, restless movement by Collin's book, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Whose title is that?
That's Collin's title.
Collin.
Yeah, so you owe us now that we mentioned the title.
That's right.
I get a copyright. I get money at royalties
You
every
do.
time you
If this is on
mention
his
it.
blog,
Actually,
your book sales are
Yes.
once again.
All right, focus.
Okay.
Within the reform stream, I think you've got a number of Brooks or whatever they might be. I mean, you've got the more traditionally reformed, and these guys. One of the big concerns is that the word reformed is being co-opted, so they wouldn't even like this discussion that, three Baptists sitting around claiming the word reformed, and want to be sensitive to that.
Right.
Another stream, just dispositionally, would be very culturally engaging, really wanting to reach cities in particular, to contextualize, to be outward focused.
Talk a lot about renewing creation,
Right.
God's plan of
Right.
redemption,
God creates all things
kingdom.
new.
Right.
Another stream would be more concerned that the gospel proclamation remains central, that those things are good, but they're not specifically the calling of the church, even though Christians themselves are called to it. I mean, there's sort of a watch blogger demographic within there that's just ready to pounce on anybody and everything. I think there's a new emerging stream of kind of radical Christianity that's very global and willing to question anything. I think of Francis Chan or David Platt. And so not sure exactly where that stream's going to go in all this.
Yeah, just kind of questioning everything to wonder, have we questioned deeply enough the assumptions that we bring to the table, especially as Americans?
Right.
I think that's a
Cultural captivity of
absolutely
the
right.
American dream. So if that's basically within the reform world, what are the other big streams going on in evangelicalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think another group that we don't talk about very much is fundamentalism. They may not be considered evangelicals. There's that distinction that goes back historically, at least to 1957. But within fundamentalism, there's a certain subset that is in conversation with some of the conservative evangelicals and find that they have a lot of overlap in common. So there's one group right there. There's also another group that would be often associated with megachurches. And I don't know, it's kind of difficult. You don't want to, there are a lot of, I don't know exactly how to describe that group though, because they don't necessarily have, they tend to be in suburbs, that's one of the things. They tend to be in the north and in the west, not so much the south, because the Southern Baptists are a whole other animal.
Right.
That's sometimes separate from broader evangelicalism.
Another one is the whole charismatic movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Huge.
Which is huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I have some friends in that world, and they have their own set of conference speakers and authors.
Magazines, charisma.
none of whom
Publishing houses.
publishing houses, and there are just tons and tons of people. I think they far outnumber our little reformed contingent.
Yeah, I think that's safe to say.
But the twain never meet. We don't know them, and they don't really know us.
Right,
Sometimes.
Well, and I think we can look at those groups as Calvinists and be very critical, and sometimes it's easy to observe some of their weaknesses because in a lot of ways we're reacting against that because some of us grew up in those worlds. I mean, I come from the main line. I grew up in a United Methodist Church, and I find myself a lot of times kind of saying, I don't want to be like that anymore. So, but certainly there are some of our own things that we have to deal with, and I wonder, as we're looking outside and critiquing these other groups, what are some things that we can improve on or that we need to look out for heading toward the future? What do you guys think?
I do think there's a temptation to not even ask that question. It's just always, what is everybody else doing wrong? There's some people that it seems like their whole focus is what's wrong with the world. And of course, you guys are both familiar with Chesterton's response to the newspaper question, what's wrong with the world? He writes in and just says, I am.
I am, right. Yeah.
I think some of it starts with just a dispositional thing to recognize each day our own insufficiency, our own sinfulness, our own desperate need for early morning mercy. And so apart from movement weaknesses, I think individually, we have that weakness of, because we're theologically oriented, that tends towards having more of a critical analysis bent, which I think is a good thing.
Right.
But it's a dangerous thing when you're always focusing on what everybody else is doing wrong or how they're not quite saying. And I think especially with younger Calvinists or guys who just come into the movement, they see, like you and I mean, both coming from the United Methodist
Right.
Church growing up, and it's just such a paradigm shift, you know, when you discover the doctrines of grace and you start to see there is a ton of error, and a lot of people have just gotten things wrong.
Right,
and you
absolutely.
get so worked up about that, you start to lose a sense of proportion.
Right.
You know, that it's okay for other people to say things that might not have every I dotted, every T crossed.
Right.
And that's not the end of the world. I think sometimes we feel like, I've got to publicly expose this thing and got to critique this and give this a long comment.
And we each have a blog where we have a chance to exercise that gift of discernment, which isn't always such a gift.
That's right. And I think it's really important to remember that a lot of what draws our attention just naturally is small. So, I mean, I think this is a problem for any Christian anywhere, but a lot of us have a practically small vision of God, and we need large God theology in all of our lives. And we need to have a large God theology that is focused on real biblical things. So, not just writing blogs or even writing books or speaking at conferences or going to conferences or having, strategy sessions with this group or that group. Those things can all be good. I'm not slamming them.
Right.
But the real work of the kingdom, the really exciting stuff, is, to go back to our earlier conversation, is in the doing. And a lot of times, I think a lot of these other movements, if you look at church history, for example, charismatics, who some of us would have theological differences with, and who weren't theologically trained, were the ones who were evangelizing like crazy, and to some extent doing some widespread discipleship and that sort of thing on a basic level. And here we are in our Reformed camps, sort of just critiquing everything and not really doing a lot of the ministry. Meanwhile, our churches are 75 people, and we think that we're the emperors of the whole movement. And that's just, frankly, I mean, nobody's the emperor, but we need to really be focused on core biblical things: evangelizing, discipling, being involved in church, training our families, these sorts of things. These are eternal things, not small things.
I've often been chastened to think about the 19th century and to think about, there are just absolute pillars of the Reformed faith in that century: Charles Hodge and B.B. Warfield and many others, and they were really very gifted theologians, and many times we often found ways to critique other aberrant theologies in good ways. But you see an undercurrent there. What happened in the 19th century? In the 19th century, you had, in the one hand, you had the rapid growth of Methodism, for example. This is what kind of stimulated my thought when you're mentioning that. And the Methodists were out there, they were doing this stuff. And the Reformed guys were talking about it. Again, I don't mean to say that Hodge and others were not doing that, but for the most part, they were missing some of what was really happening on the ground and losing connection with some of the masses. And that I think led to serious weaknesses. And by the end of that century, that a lot of that energy that had come from the Methodists had it had shifted in turn and had gone into just straight up liberalism, to the point where you start the 20th century, the Reformed faith in and of itself is greatly undermined. And it's a sobering century to look at. I'm not even sure exactly which lessons to apply there, but it just reminded me when you're talking about some of the talking versus the doing.
Right.
It's not a dichotomy that has to be there, though.
Yeah.
This has been another great conversation. Just as Collin was talking, I was thinking of another, critiquing those who are practicing self-promotion or self-aggrandizement in a way. But even that caught myself of, that's still critiquing others, and they're focused on self and not looking at my own self and my own weaknesses and sinfulness.
And it's really hard in this day and age not to have egg on your face in that response. If you're a person who's active and engaged, I think a lot of us have sin in this area, and we have these patterns. We are not self-critical about things. I know that I am not always self-critical about what I write and what I am concerned with, and we desperately need to look, I think, hard at the internet, and especially, I think we need to look hard at social media, Facebook, Twitter, blogging. I think we need to look hard at these things and say, am I self-promoting? Because when I take a critical look at myself and others, it seems like this could be a lot bigger problem than we realize.
And it's
I think we should probably wrap it up there, but thank you guys. Appreciate both of you, and may we continue to try to put ourselves to death and
That's right.
focus on the cross
Exalt
and carry
Christ.
it.
That's
Carry it each
exactly
day.
Amen.